Okay, to give you an overview of the VDI infrastructure, let's start looking at the how the terminal services used to be in the Windows 2003 server days. We basically, the client would make a request through some public network via VPN to terminal services. And then terminal server was installed basically on Windows 2003, and all the applications were installed on the same server. Um, the issue with the old architecture is that all the applications were available and to everybody, that anybody would access to the same terminal services. And so let's just quickly take a look at the animation of the client making a request to terminal services, and that's how the session gets delivered to public network through the VPN. This is a pre-VDI days. Now let's just look at what the VDI infrastructure is. Number one is the VDI is not a product. VDI is just a centralized desktop delivery architecture, and again, it's not a product. So when we talk about VDI, we talk about the delivery platform. Users basically have centralized storage, execution, and management of centralized desktop that is being accessed via a centralized fashion. Typically, the VDI infrastructure is in a data center, and then the users, they come actually over the remote or the corporate or offshores that they access the infrastructure. So here is what the typical VDI infrastructure looks like. On the client is obviously could be a WISE terminal or a XP a machine, the older machines. And then we have the first entry point to the VDI infrastructure is a remote desktop gateway. Remote desktop gateway, the purpose of it is to define a policy of who can access the VDI infrastructure, and then the second policy of what kind of a computer resources it can access. Remote desktop gateway is not a mandatory service to have present. We could actually get away without it by just having a remote desktop gateway web access, which is the second server to the right of the gateway. Remote desktop web access is just the web page that it gets presented to the users based on the policies that users would have access to in a certain applications or a certain desktop. Domain controller is obviously the essential part of the any VDI infrastructure. Remote desktop connection broker is the central intelligence. It allows a definition of or composing sessions. In other words, which users could get one application. Again, this is what is a big differentiator between the new VDI infrastructure and how the terminal services used to be, because everybody would get everything. Now we have an option of telling who is going to get what. Very important that this VDI, we gotta have the Active Directory function level has to be Windows 2008 R2. Then we have the session host. Here we show two session hosts. One of them is acting as a redirector, and one of them using as a for publishing a remote application. So every time that we have VM pools or personalized VMs, then one of our session hosts has to act as a redirector. And once you make a session host to act as a redirector, then you cannot publish an applications. You would have a secondary session host or a farm of session hosts to publish other applications. Virtual host server is used for the VM for publishing a pool of virtual machines or personalized virtual machines. It has to run on its own Hyper-V, so as consequently its own dedicated server. And then here in the architecture, we're showing the MEDV and AppV. And MEDV is just basically using a virtual PC to allow application gets delivered streamed down to the client. And then the AppV for sandboxing, and then for centralized management of the application is the facilitator to allow migration of the XP to a more modern operating system, or the applications that do not behave well with the Windows 7, that we could inject those into the environment. Next is within the VDI infrastructure, the important is we have to have a PKI and then the SSL in place to allow these servers to talk to each other and communicate with each other. The sources, there's basically for the PK and then SSL infrastructure, you could either buy the certificates or install a certificate server, an Active Directory integrated or standalone. Or if you're working in a lab, you could just download three utilities, make cert.exe and cert2spc.exe. They're part of the Windows SDK in Windows 7 and .NET Framework 4 and PVK import.exe. Basically, it's a three-step process that you could create a self-generated certificate for each of the servers and export the public and private key, and then once you have the PFX file that contains the keys, then you could put it into the secondary server or whichever servers that you have to have a TLS connection between them. So I mean, these are the options for having a PKI and HTTPS. Next is I'm going to talk about the delivery mechanism as the the simplest form of the VDI is when the app we have a client that it wants to access a single application, let's just say Office application, and in that case the client basically make a request, goes to the remote desktop gateway, gets authorized, and then it comes to the connection broker. Connection broker sends them to the session host, and then the published applications based on all the policy and interpretation of how the connection broker was defined, it gets returned to the client. So this is the simplest form of application delivery in this scenario. The next scenario is a client may want to have a WinTerminal, Wise Terminal, or Windows XP, and it wants to have a VM, but the VM has to come from a pool. This makes sense if you have a call center. Everybody have their desktop look exactly identical. There's nothing specialized or nothing personalized about each of these desktops. So the client would basically make a request. The request comes to the gateway and goes to the domain controller for authentications, goes to the connection broker for all the policies, goes to the redirector. From redirectors goes to the virtual host server, and then one of the VM pools, it gets pulled out of this pool and gets returned and then gets assigned to the client. The next scenario is in accessing the personalized virtual machines on a Hyper-V. So if the user have their own application that nobody else uses, and in that scenario, then we have to assign the same application, same desktop with all those applications to the user at all times. And so those are defined based on the policies within the system, and then the request comes from the client, goes to the gateway, and then the user gets authenticated, goes to the connection broker to read the policies, goes to redirector, comes to the virtual host, and now we know which personalized VM belongs to the user, and that gets returned to the user. Next scenario is connecting to the remote resources based on web access. Now if you notice that the remote desktop gateway is missing, so the user is making first point of entry is making an SSL connections to the web access. So the request comes to the web access, and a web page gets returned for login. The user enters the information and gets authenticated, and the web access based on the policy from the other systems from the VDI infrastructure returns a web page that contains all the icons and the anything else that the users are authorized to access. And the last scenario is the basically be showing how the MEDV and AppV can be integrated into injecting let's just say IE6 has to get delivered to the user because they have the older application, or older that it does not run the IE8, or maybe applications that it could be a 32-bit application, 16-bit application that is not migrated to Windows 7. And then we are serving Windows 7 from the pool of VM or personalized VM. So let's quickly, the clients make a request, comes to the gateway, gets authenticated, goes to the connection broker, goes to the redirector, and based on redirector goes to the virtual host server to pull a VM. So the VM gets initiated, and the VM, let's just say, is a Windows 7 desktop. Now we got to go to MedB and pull an IE6. So we stream an IE6 into the application. That whole desktop gets returned. So the users end up with a desktop, has IE6, had IE8, and has Windows 7. And then we delivered everything to the user using this infrastructure. So this is pretty much sums up what the VDI infrastructure is, and the next session we're going to be demoing all these components in the lab environment. Thank you.